Hey there, Brian Goulet of GouletPens.com here, and it is, what day is it? October 9th of 2015. I had to check because I was gone all of last week, and it was pretty crazy. So long story short, I did not have a Q&A last week. This is episode number 97, by the way, coming up on 100 here. So basically, my son started kindergarten about a month ago, and he had all kinds of nice, fresh, new germs to bring home. He ended up getting walking pneumonia after his first week of school. He was okay, though, recovered pretty quickly. But a couple weeks later, hey, guess what? Now, Rachel, my wife, has full-on pneumonia, and my daughter had walking pneumonia as well. For those of you who don't know, walking pneumonia is essentially just a less aggressive version of pneumonia. So you get fluid in the lungs and coughing and all that kind of stuff. So basically, Rachel had a fever of 104.7, was starting to hallucinate and stuff like that because her fever was so high. So we went to the urgent care, got her checked out. Her fever came down. She never had to be hospitalized because it was just a spike and then it came down. So she was all taken care of, but she was basically laid out all of last week. And I was like, well, my daughter had a slight fever, had a bit of a cough. So I was like, well, let me be proactive here. I'll take her to the doctor. So I made an appointment for Monday morning, took her in, and the doctor was like, well, yeah, you know, she probably should be checked out. You know, she's got some low oxygen level and stuff like that. So he's like, well, there's a pediatric ER, they can do a chest x-ray and all that kind of stuff. So I went there, they did an x-ray and all this kind of stuff. They said her oxygen level's low, they put her on oxygen, and they're like, oh yeah, by the way, now that she's been on oxygen, she has to stay here for at least 24 hours. I was like, really? Well, thanks. I had like no clothes, I didn't even have Ellie's like favorite blanket or any of that kind of stuff. And it was like, nope, you now have a 3-year-old that is on an IV and oxygen and all this stuff. Dad. So there you go. And I was like, well, okay, so this is going to be my life now for the next few days. So basically, Ellie was in the hospital for 2.5 days. She's okay. She's doing great. She never like got to a scary level or anything like that, but her oxygen was low and she just needed some time to recuperate. And when kids get sick like that, things can turn bad really quickly. So they wanted her to be there in case that happened. It did not happen. So she was okay, but it took a couple of days for her to recover. And so literally it was like I got half hour of sleep that first night because she had to get nebulizer treatments around the clock and, you know, had to be on oxygen. And of course she's 3, she doesn't know what's going on and she's in this strange place and she wants her mother, but her mother's sick so she can't come to the hospital and she couldn't even drive. It was much of an adventure. So I ended up taking off all of last week. My team here was awesome. They took care of business last week. So they were like, you know what, we're fine. And I was like, if you're fine, I'm fine. Let's just let me take care of my family. So that's what we ended up doing. So that's why there's no Q&A. So I apologize for no Q&A, but I'm sure all of you understand completely. Had to be there for my family. So that's what it's all about, right? That's why we're here, to help, you know, do our thing, but also take care of our family and be where we need to be. So that's kind of what it's been on the personal front. So this week has been much better. Everybody's doing much better and all that. I never really like got completely sick either. I've had a little bit of a cough, but thankfully I've avoided it all, even though it hit my whole family. So go figure. Now, yay, the joys of school. But Joseph loved kindergarten, so that's kind of cool. Anyway, so we've had some new products come in. We got the Rhodia Premium Color, which I should have grabbed one beforehand, forgot to. But anyway, it's on our site. It's just a Rhodia Premium pad with different colored covers. So that's kind of cool. So neat little thing there. We got silver Rhodia web notebooks, which are pretty cool. They actually look like a kind of a brushed stainless steel or like a brushed aluminum. Looks really cool, so that's kind of neat. Same price as the regular Webbies too, so that's pretty neat. We got 5 new Jinhao colors. I didn't grab any of these beforehand. I should have shown them. Oh well, sorry. But we got those on the site too. Those are pretty cool. The Jinhao 159 is a very, very large pen. I have a video on the 159 that you can check out previously, but there's 5 new colors, so that's kind of cool. One of which is a really nice Goulet blue and a big bling and gold one. So some very, very vibrant colors going on there. And then we've got some Viscontis that we've launched. So the Rembrandts we did a couple of weeks ago. The Homo Sapiens was last week. Got a rather epic 20-minute video on the Homo Sapiens, but I know it's a lot of people's holy grail pen, so I tried to pack as much information in there as possible. So go check that out. And then we also just got in, I can actually probably show this because I have it here. The Visconti Millenium Arc rainbow. So there's the rainbow and the moonlight. We don't have the moonlight yet, but we did get the rainbows in. So that's pretty cool. They're still available now, so you can check them out. But it's a crescent filler. And the rainbow actually looks really, really nice. Like way nicer than I initially thought it would based on the pictures. So it's a numbered limited edition. List price is $3.59 or something like that. So if you put it in your cart, you can see our best price that we can offer there. So you can go check that out. It's lower than that. I'll just give you a hint. It's got a spring clip. It's got a little double arc thing. Pretty cool. And it's got the chromium tubular nib. So it helps keep it from drying out and stuff like that. I was writing with it a bunch yesterday, and it's very nice feeling nib. So it's a chromium nib, which is kind of a component that's often used in stainless steel. So it's kind of like a higher grade stainless steel, sort of. So chromium is its own element that's often used as alloys for stainless steel. But I think like the chromium 18 or whatever is like a higher end metal that's often used in like high-end flatware and stuff like that for stain resistance and things. So, but it feels really good. It's still kind of stiff like a steel nib, but it's smooth and still writes really wet, just like pretty much all the Viscontis do. But that's a really cool pen. And the crescent filler's got a good ink capacity too, pushing upwards of 2 milliliters, so that's pretty nice. And then we've got some pens that are to come. We got the Van Gogh that's going to be launching next week. I think I've got that around here somewhere too. I have I personally chose the Starry Night Van Gogh as my pen of choice. It's 18 faceted. It's very similar to the Rembrandt, which I have a video on as well. Actually, I have a blue Rembrandt right here. So it's very similar to that. And I just have the blue ones, which are pretty similar. Same nibs on them, both magnetic cap. Similar type of resin, but the packaging and stuff that the Van Gogh comes in is really cool. It's got this, Starry Night, so it kind of matches the painting there. Pretty cool. Of course, I'm dropping stuff everywhere, but so there's that. And then we're gonna have some other cool pens too. I know we've been like going bananas with Visconti lately, and it's part of it's we've been just carrying their regular line pens like the Van Gogh and the Rembrandts and the Homo Sapiens, but then also there's some limited edition stuff like the Rainbow, and then there's going to be some other stuff coming out too, like the Saturno is going to be coming out soon, and then we're going to have an exclusive pen called the Opera Master in Crimson Tide, which is going to be pretty cool. And then the traveling ink pod as well, which I have right here, and I plan to shoot a video on that because I know a lot of people have asked about that. So there you go, just lots of stuff going on. So more stuff will be coming in. We're going to have the Diamine Shimmertastic inks coming very, very soon. We thought it would be the end of this week, but we are still kind of unsure about that because we didn't get tracking confirmation and all that kind of things, but we know it's coming. It's going to be here very, 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 very soon. And we also happen to kind of be surprised by getting the mini pilot Iroshizuku bottles early. So we have those available now. So that's pretty cool. So we've just been getting stuff early, and stuff's been getting delayed, and we got restocked on some Twisby Ecos, and we got another small shipment of Midnight Thunder premieres in. Those will probably be gone pretty soon, and then we'll get more of those to come probably next week or so. But I know Brian Gray and his family's all kind of like taking vacations here and there, so they're a little light on staffing right now. So the pens are going to trickle in for a little bit before we can kind of get caught up on those. But that's it for new products for the moment. There definitely will be more to come. So it's going to be next couple of months is just going to be rough on your wallet. So I'm apologizing, but also kind of not, because it's some awesome stuff. But I'm apologizing sort of tongue-in-cheek here for the next couple of months, because it's just going to be awesome/rough for you. All right, so I got a bunch of questions this week. I got 14, so I'm going to try and pack them in, all right? And a lot of pen writing questions. So let's kick it off here with Beer for Bill on Twitter. Good handle there, Bill. Bill asks, do all Pilot stainless steel nib pens start and write the same? Okay, so there are a bunch. Pilot's got a pretty wide range of pens. So the stainless steel nibs one we're talking about, we've got the Metropolitan, the Prera, the Varsity, the Plumix. Those are the ones that I have available, and the Parallel as well. There's other ones like the Kakuno, which is going to be coming into the US. It's not here yet. There's other ones like the 78G, which I think is discontinued. I don't know, it's not available in the US. The Knight, which has been discontinued, and the Penmanship, which is not in the US as well. But these are still all popular pens that are often talked about online. So I'm looking at my notes a lot because there's a lot of pens to think about here. So the Metropolitan and the Prera use the same nibs. So those will write the same. The Plumix uses the same feed, and the nib style is the same. It's swappable with the Prera and the Metropolitan, but it's an Italic nib, or a stub, or whatever you want to call it. So the nib itself is different, but actually there is a Prera with an Italic nib on it. That's the same as what's on the Plumix. So there you go. So the Plumix is, it's kind of a weird pen shape. I call it the squid pen because it kind of looks like a squid. But basically the nib swaps between them all, so it writes very similarly. 78G, the Knight, penmanship, all have the same style of nib, so you can swap the nibs between all of them. The Knight actually has the exact same nib as which on the Metropolitan and on the Prera. So all of these are going to write very, very similarly. The ones that are different is the Varsity. The Varsity has a completely different style of nib, and it's a medium nib only, and it's a little bit softer. So it's a disposable pen, so it's a little bit softer, but I imagine if you used the same Varsity for years, it wouldn't hold up as well as some of these other more durable steel nibs. And that's okay, because it's a $3 pen. So it's all right. You can go through a lot of them for the price that you would for a more expensive pen. But it actually does write really nicely. So the nib size on the medium is going to be the same, maybe a little bit broader than it would be on some of the other ones. So that one's a little bit different. The Parallel is very different because I'll call it an Italic or a stub nib, but the nib is just very, very different. It's not a single piece of steel with a slit down the middle that is wide and flat. It's actually two plates that are put together. So basically the whole nib is like the slit of a nib that goes together. It's a very different design of pen that is really, really completely different. I have a video on the Pilot Parallels, which actually Rachel shot 4.5 years ago or 4 years ago or something like that, back in our house, our old house. So you can check that out. Very interesting video to watch there. But she shows you how the Parallel works, so that's pretty cool. And then the Kakuno has a little bit different nib. I think it's a similar style to the Metropolitan and Prera and stuff like that, but I haven't had extensive use of the Kakuno because it's not here in the US yet. Still waiting on it. I think it's going to be a couple of months yet still before we're going to get some. Demand has been really hot and they just don't have capacity to produce more of them to have them available in the US. So a little bummed about that. But essentially, other than these pens like the Parallel that is really just designed completely different, and the Varsity, most of the Pilot steel nibs are going to write very, very similarly. So kind of the cost difference and stuff you're going to have is going to be more on the body of the pen and so on. So there you go. I hope you helps you out there when you're choosing your Pilot ones. But my personal favorite is the Metropolitan. I feel like that's the best bang for the buck, and I really enjoy that quite a bit. But really all the Pilot steel nibs are pretty great. All right, next question. This is from Jim C on Facebook. Said, what are your favorite stealth pens? And what are some notebooks and inks to match? And I'm now realizing I forgot to grab all my notebooks, but that's all right. I still have a bunch of pens to show you. So some of my favorites, personally, that are nice and stealthy. The Vanishing Point Matte Black, which I actually have the older version of it with the steel nib, the rhodium plated gold nib, but you can now get a black plated gold nib. So you can get it really stealthy with that black nib now. So that's pretty sweet. Definitely a super stealthy pen. So check that one out. The Lamy All-Star in the matte black is pretty sweet. You can also get that with a black nib if you want. So that's pretty cool. And then you can get the Lamy 2000. I like that one as well. It's not quite as super stealthy because it's got a little stainless steel on there, so it's not as stealthy, but it's definitely a more stealthical pen. The Lamy Safari Charcoal is quite stealthy as well. It's more of a matte, but it's a little more of a, it's really more of a dark gray than it is a true black, but it's definitely stealthy as well. And then, this one's not completely as stealthy, but the Visconti Homo Sapiens, okay, yes, this pen blows all the others out of the water in terms of price range, so still, maybe it's not like, oh, I want a stealthy pen, let me get this one, but it definitely has a stealth factor to it. It's got a little bit of bling as well, so it's not quite as stealthy, but definitely I still like it for that kind of matte black look to it, and you can get it with the bronze or the steel finish on it, which the steel probably looks a little more stealthy than the bronze. But and then you've got a black Pilot Metropolitan as well, which has a little bit of bling to it. It doesn't have a black nib or anything like that, but it's still a little bit on the stealthy side, and maybe not quite so much as like the the Vanishing Point or whatever, but that would work really well. So as far as notebooks, you got a lot of options. Pretty much any black notebook. you know, because you don't have black paper or anything like that. And all the black notebooks that I have are going to be black, and that's about it. There's no like crazy designs or anything. So some of them are black. Rhodia Web notebook. There's some Leuchtturm notebooks that are black as well. The Field Notes Pitch Black is going to be really good too. So those are some of the blackest ones. You can also get a Midori Traveler's notebook in black, so it's a black leather. You can put whatever notebooks you want inside. So that's those are some of the notebook options that I have. But really, finding black notebooks is not that hard because it's a pretty common color of notebook. Inks, really any black ink. I like Noodler's Black, Heart of Darkness. Those are some of my favorites. Aurora Black, really wet, dark black. Platinum Carbon Black as well, if you want that nice black permanent thing. But honestly, I think we have something like 45 or 50 different blacks in our store. So you have a lot of options. Cool. All right, next question I got. This is from Carissa S on Facebook. I noticed while playing around with Jerbon, Emerald of Chivor, gorgeous, gorgeous ink, that writing pressure seems to affect the color that is put down on the page. Less pressure brings out the lighter green side of the ink, while more pressure brings out the red sheen for more. Is this usual? Would writing pressure affect the shading on all inks? Okay, so you got kind of two different parts of your question here, talking specifically about Emerald of Chivor and then just inks in general. So I will say specifically with Emerald of Chivor, yes, you are going to see more of that red that's going to come out. For one, if you have ink resistant paper, that's probably the most important factor. If you have really absorbent paper, it almost doesn't matter how much ink you put on the page, it's just going to soak it all up. You got to really dump it on. If you have like an inkjet copy paper or just like a moleskin or something that's really absorbent, it's not going to show a lot of that sheen pretty much no matter what you do. So if you have an ink resistant paper like Rhodia, Clairefontaine, any laser jet paper, like laser copy paper, that works well. Anything really ink resistant like that, Tomoe River is like the best for getting sheen to come out. Then you're going to see more of that red, you're going to see more of that gold that's going to come out as well, because it's got a gold kind of glitter thing going on with it too. That is definitely the way to go. And then so that is completely normal and usual. And then what you're hitting on kind of with the second part of your question is more about, is the writing pressure going to affect whatever ink that you're using in terms of how dark it might look or what kind of sheen it would bring out? The answer is absolutely yes. Specifically with softer nibs and flex nibs and things like that, no question. But not just with those. I mean, those are essentially kind of exacerbating what is kind of typically an issue or an effect or whatever you want to call it, based on your writing pressure that could happen even with a normal fountain pen. So if you have any fountain pen, if you write with lighter pressure, it's going to put less ink on the page. You write with more pressure, it's going to, the more pressure you put, the more it's going to kind of spread the tines apart, allow more ink to flow through, and put more ink down on the page. That's just the physics of it. However, if you do it too much, you can damage the nib, you can, cause the ink capillary action to break down and then cause it to railroad. That's where railroading is basically when the nib tines spread so much that the capillary action breaks and the ink doesn't flow through the nib into a single line anymore, but it breaks and kind of like travels just down each part of the nib, and you end up with two lines that write on it. And it won't write forever, it'll just write for a little bit and then dry up because you've broken the flow of ink. That happens a lot more on flex nib pens and soft nibs that you're pushing too far. It's not typical to get railroading on normal fountain pens when you're using the appropriate amount of pressure. It's really only it's a flexing term. So that said, yes, it definitely is a factor. And even with inks that don't have like a sheen or anything to it like that, typically what you'll see when you write with more pressure is the ink will be darker and more saturated with the more pressure you use as opposed to a lighter pressure. It's not just the pressure too, it could also be the writing angle. And the reason that the angle could be a big difference is depending on how the nib tipping material is ground, they're not all a perfect spherical ball. Sometimes there's some handwork that's involved in kind of honing them. Sometimes the way that it's tipped and honed and stuff like that can be different from one pen to another, and they can have kind of a sweet spot. Like the Lamy 2000 is one that is kind of notorious for having kind of its own sweet spot, and those nibs are ground at kind of a specific shape that is kind of different from some other fountain pens. So those you might be more sensitive to holding it more straight up versus down like this. So that can affect not only how much, you know, kind of flex or spring you can have. The further down you have your pen, the more it's going to kind of flex and spring, so it might tend to write a little bit wetter. If you hold it more upright, generally, it's going to write a little drier, just pretty much with any fountain pen. So that can be an effect. But also the tipping material, the way that it's ground, holding it at different angles can actually affect the line width and how dark it is and stuff like that. So there's a lot of different factors going on. Not to mention the ink itself can be a huge factor. The absorbency of the paper is a factor. Your writing speed even can be a factor. If you're writing really fast, it's not going to be probably quite as wet as you would if you were writing a little bit slower and more intentionally. So there can be a lot of things that can affect how an ink looks when you put it down on the page, even with the same nib size. Literally, I'm not joking. Maybe I should shoot a video on this sometime, but I will use the exact same pen, ink, paper as my wife, Rachel. She holds her pen very differently than I do. She writes with a different angle, different writing pressure, everything. She writes completely differently than I do. And the inks look a lot darker when I use them than it does with her. So she often uses like really, really saturated, wet flowing inks. Whereas I will have a tendency, I mean, I still enjoy those, but I don't need those quite as much as she does, because just the way that she writes tends to put a little bit less ink down on the page. So it's amazing how different an ink can look, even just all else the same, just me writing versus her, how that can look differently. So that is a huge factor, and that is part of why when you read reviews and you are seeing all these different opinions that people have, people will be absolutely adamant about how one ink performs or how one pen writes, and then someone else will be equally as adamant with a completely differing opinion. And the fact is they're both right, because they're just having two different experiences based on a variety of these different factors. So it's one of the things I love, but also one of the things I hate about fountain pens is it's so personal and unique an experience writing with one pen to another, depending on who you are and how you write. But that also makes it completely maddening when you're trying to like find this very consistent kind of predictable experience that you read about other people having, and then you try it for yourself and it might be different. Sometimes better, sometimes worse. You never know until you kind of try it. So that's just kind of the roll of the dice when you're dealing with fountain pens. But it's you know, it can be a factor there for sure. Lots of different things going on. So you know, it's just, you gotta love it. Gotta love it. Kristen E on Facebook said, I have mostly extra fine or fine tip pens, and I'm interested in trying out an Italic tip. What would you recommend as a starter to try out the broader tip? Okay, so the tip is the writing part of the nib. That's the part that actually touches the page. Lamy is always a good bet. I like Lamy, you know, Safari, maybe All-Star. Those don't come available with Italic nibs on them, but if you have any of those pens, you can buy just the Italic nib and you can swap it out and put it on your Lamy pens. So that's a nice way to be able to switch and swap in between. Or you can get a Lamy Joy. Those come with the Italic tip on it. The Joy is like a scriptier looking longer pen. So I'm personally not as much of a fan of the Joy as an everyday pen, but it could certainly work. So that's one way to go about it. I like that option because Lamys are pretty great, reliable, very durable pens anyway, and the fact you can swap those nibs makes them very utilitarian in that way. Another option is if you have a pen with a number 6 size nib on it, for example, you know, Noodler's Conrad or Ahab. If you have a, you know, a lot of other brands will have a number 6. Jinhao is a really great one because those pens are very inexpensive, and then you can swap them out with a Goulet number 6 nib. And I'm totally plugging myself here on that, and I realize that. And I'm sort of sorry, but sort of not, because part of the reason that I offer these pens with these nibbed combinations is there's a lot of people that like to get, say, a Jinhao, which normally does not come with an Italic nib, or a Noodler's, which normally does not come with an Italic nib, and you can get a Goulet 1.1, swap it on there. A lot of people love doing that, very successful. Those are high quality Jowo nibs. We, you know, check and tune all of them, so they are going to be maximum writing pleasure. So a lot of good experiences with those. So that's a good way, you know, maybe not like the cheapest, but if you, you know, for a starter pen, you're talking a Jinhao, might be running you about $10. And then you can put a $15 nib on it, so $25. Not a bad price. That's a little bit less than what you're going to pay for, you know, Lamy Safari or something like that. So not bad. So that I would recommend. Another good one is a Pilot Parallel. Now, the smallest Pilot Parallel you're going to get is a 1.5 millimeter, which is pretty wide as it is. With the Lamy or the Goulet, I would recommend going with the 1.1 millimeter. That's kind of a more all-around user-friendly stub nib or italic nib. And by the way, stub and italic are often used interchangeably. Pretty much everything you're getting is a stub. There's very, very few actual italics out there. Italics are very crisp, the edges are very sharp, and they write very scratchy. So most companies don't make them because they get a lot of returns for people saying the pens are scratchy and don't write well, when in fact that's how they're supposed to write if they're actually italic. So everybody makes stubs. They round those edges off and make them so that they write a lot smoother, sacrifice a little bit in the line variation, but not enough to really make it worth the difference for most people to have that scratchy versus not scratchy experience. So the Pilot Parallel would definitely be a great choice if you want something on the wider end. Those go from 1.5 up to 6 millimeter. So that's like if you're kind of testing out doing some calligraphy and stuff, that would be a great way to go. Those are only 10 bucks too, so great options there. The other one is a Pilot Plumix. That one's a, it's a $9 pen, and it is a stub nib, but it's not a very smooth stub, so it's not really my favorite, but if you kind of tune it and tweak it a little bit, it's still a pretty darn good pen for the price that it is. So those would be some of the best options that I think I have for you. Next question is from Vasco D on Facebook. I'm currently looking forward to buying a pen with a very crisp italic nib. Can you give me some suggestions from your store? So I just talked about this a second ago, but basically no one does very crisp italic nibs. For one, it's a little bit harder to do because you have to kind of know what you're doing when you're tuning them. But another reason is that pretty much 98% of the people that would buy them would return them because they don't like the experience or they think that they're too scratchy. So it takes a lot of patience and a very, very steady hand to write well with a crisp italic nib. That said, typically you usually have to buy them from a Nibmeister because most pen companies don't bother making very crisp italics. The one kind of exception is Aurora on their Ypsilon, which we do have. It's a $99 pen, has a rather crisp italic. It's the crispest italic nib I've ever seen coming from a pen company. And those will give you kind of that crisp writing experience you're looking for. That said, we've had higher than your normal average of returns on those pens because people think they write too scratchy. But really it's just that the nib is ground very sharp, so it's not forgiving much at all in terms of rotation in your hand. So a lot of people, when they're writing, they tend to rotate the pen in their hand, especially as they're going from one side of the page to the other. And a lot of people think it's a bad writing experience. Not a lot of people, but people that don't really kind of know what they're getting into think it's a bad writing experience, which I totally understand because it's just not your typical nib. So if you're going to get that pen, make sure you know what you're getting into. But that's pretty much the best option I have for you. Everything else is kind of more rounded out, and it really isn't, especially as you're saying, a very crisp italic. That is the best option that I'm going to have for you. Really, I have no other very crisp italics. Jana D on Facebook says, "Hi Brian, love your videos and your store. Great store." Well, thanks, Janet. I bought several fountain pens, inks, converters, etc. I'm just getting into fountain pens and have about 8 so far. I've asked in a previous post about the difference in the nibs between the Platinum Plaisir and the Platinum Balance. Then I saw your video on the Platinum Cool and its ability to flex somewhat. How does a cool nib compare to the other two? If the looks of the Balance in green, but also, or you like the look of the green, but also demonstrators. Okay, cool. So, yes, the Balance, I got a few things to clarify here. You talk about the Balance and the Plaisir and all this kind of stuff. So you basically have two groups of pens, all right? You've got the Preppy and the Plaisir, and then you have the Balance and the Cool. The nib on the Preppy and the Plaisir is the same. The nib on the Balance and the Cool is the same. But the nib on the Preppy Plaisir is different than the Balance Cool. Okay, so you're asking me to compare the Cool and the Plaisir, the Plaisir and the Balance. Those have completely different nibs. However, I can talk about all of these. Now that you mentioned the Cool and the Balance have the exact same nib, it's just different color. The Plaisir and the Preppy, the only difference is the body of the pen. So if you look, I'll even zoom in a little bit because that'll help to show you. So if you look at the Plaisir and the Preppy, right? Now you can see how badly I need to shave, but the Preppy, so I'm gonna pull that off. And the Plaisir, there you go. And I grabbed the same color so that you could really see. Now the Preppy is in the process of being redesigned. So the color of the Preppy and the Plaisir nibs are gonna be changing somewhat, but up until what has been kind of in the past so far, you can actually see the feed and is the same, and you can actually pull the nib and feed out of this pen, and it's completely identical on the two. So you can switch them, swap them, whatever you want to do. It's just the bodies of the pen that are different. And in fact, if I'm not mistaken, I think you can even swap the grips of the pens as well between these, which is kind of cool because if you want to get an extra fine writing plaisir, the plaisir doesn't come in an extra fine nib. Will it actually swap? That is an interesting thing. I've never actually tested this, so I'll show you right now. Yep. Okay, so you can swap a plaisir and preppy grip section even. You don't even have to pull the nib. So you can switch and swap them between the two. They are identical. That's part of the economies of scale and why these pens are so affordable. So that's pretty cool, and you're able to do that. So yes, just want to make sure I put them back together well. Now let's look at the platinum balance and the cool. If I pull both of these off, you'll see that these are a different design than the preppy and the plaisir, but they are the same, except for the balances are all opaque colors and have gold trim. The cool are all demonstrators and have rhodium trim. So that's pretty cool. That's cool. So the feed is different on these than it is on the preppy and the plaisir. They're nicer pens, you know, thicker, more durable, that kind of thing. And they'll give you a more, I wouldn't call them flexible, but they can give you some line variation when you press on them on the page. I wouldn't do it all the time because it's not necessarily what they're designed for, but you can do it there. So to show you a comparison here between the preppy plaisir and the platinum cool balance, you can see that the nib is a similar kind of shape. So if you're just quickly looking online, it might look similar to you, but the feed and everything is completely different. The feed, you know, is a whole different setup on the two pens. It's going to write a little bit differently on those, and I think the cool and the balance is a little bit smoother overall as well. But honestly, none of them are bad pens, so I think all of them are pretty good options for you to consider. But if you're looking for that somewhat softer writing experience, you're going to go with the cool or the balance. Cool. Cool. Next question. This is from Macrov on YouTube. What do you feel about the smoothness of the writing experience? For me, I like a glassy, silky smooth writing experience. I don't enjoy feedback in the slightest. I know that a lot of times people like feedback so they can feel where they're writing. Very true. Am I strange to not enjoy even the smallest amount of feedback? I enjoy my broad TWSBI Eco because of how smooth mine is. Okay, that's very valid, and you know, Macrov, you are not alone in that. There are a lot of people that want the absolute smoothest writing experience possible. That's why you get Clairefontaine paper is some of the smoothest paper out there. That's why you use, you know, really wet, smooth writing inks, so you don't have to write with like any pressure at all, and it can be very smooth. That's why you tend towards broader nibs, because broader nibs generally tend to be smoother than fine and extra fine nibs. That's where you tend to go when you are wanting that super smooth experience. Oftentimes nib makers or pen manufacturers will make pens that are not super glassy smooth because it's not really the middle ground. Like, there's a lot of people that want really smooth nibs. There's some people that don't like smooth nibs at all. They want nibs where you can really feel what's going on. So there's some that are kind of on different ends of the spectrum. So most pen companies kind of meeting somewhere in the middle, trying to go smooth but with a little touch of feedback. So they'll hone them and tune them to a point and then stop because they don't want super glassy, because some people might not be happy with that. So they tend to go kind of somewhere in the middle. So usually for folks like yourself who want everything to be as super glassy smooth as possible, there are some pen brands out there that have really smooth, right? With no feedback at all. You know, Visconti being one of them that tends to go on the smoother side. You know, it takes a lot more honing and tuning and stuff like that. Those pens tend to be a little more expensive. However, if you want to get some less expensive pens, they certainly have the capability of being as smooth as more expensive pens. But usually it's good to go with your own smoothing supplies, which is why we offer these at gouletpens.com. So going with a loop is a good idea at first. I didn't even mention the loop in my notes, but a loop is basically a small magnifying glass that allows you to inspect your nib tines to make sure that they're aligned. That's always a good idea before you get into smoothing anything, because if your tines are out of alignment, when you go smoothing, you're only going to smooth one side of it and it's going to go throwing your nib off. So you want to make sure that your tines are correct. and that will help you give the best foundation for smoothing as possible. If you want to actually smooth, I have videos separately on both micro mesh and mylar paper. This is my fairly well used one that I have here, but it feels almost like leather, but it is an abrasive. So it's a very, very fine abrasive. But if you have a well-tuned nib, a well-aligned nib, and you want to smooth it out a bit, micro mesh is usually a good place to start. And that will just help to smooth out any rough spots that you have on there. But if you really, really want to get it super smooth, that's where mylar paper comes in. Micro mesh will pretty much get it to where most pen manufacturers are tuning their nibs. Very smooth with a hint of feedback. This is 12,000 grit, which is, I don't know the equivalent of like a sandpaper grit, but it's pretty darn fine. This stuff goes even finer. I think the micro mesh here, 12,000 grit, I want to say it's somewhere around 3 microns thick in terms of the grits. So the mylar paper, it doesn't even feel like an abrasive because it's so smooth to the hand. But it is. There's a shiny side, which is useless, and then there's a matte side, which is where the abrasive actually is. So this stuff is super, super fine. There's a 1 micron and a 0.3 micron. So if you really want to go smooth, you have your well-aligned nib, you've done your micro mesh, then you go to the 1 micron, which is about 3 times finer than micro mesh, and then the 0.3, which is 3 times finer than this. So you can really, you don't want to go crazy on this stuff because, it's not going to, you're essentially at this point, you're polishing the tip of the nib. You're not, sandpapering it away or anything. But that will be, and you want to use a really, really light hand when you do it, but those are the tools that you need, and for essentially a few dollars, you can tune whatever of your own nibs you want. Now, a nice caveat I want to say here is when you get into tuning and adjusting your own nibs, you're technically voiding the warranties on those nibs for those pens. So don't go grabbing your, Visconti Divina. There you go, very expensive pen. You don't want to go grabbing that and say, I want it to be smoother. Let me just go take it to micro mesh. Be careful when you're doing that kind of thing because especially when you get into softer nibs and stuff like that, it can be, you need a little practice before you get into tuning it. Otherwise, it's pretty hard to like really screw up a nib with these materials, especially the mylar. It's so gentle of an abrasive. It's really hard to do any real damage. But the micro mesh, you could if you overdo it too much. So you just want to be careful, especially if you're writing with too much pressure. You want to make sure you're writing literally with no more pressure than the weight of the pen itself when you're doing figure eights and stuff that you're doing on these. So I would definitely take something like Pilot Metropolitan or something that's relatively inexpensive. If you screw it up, it's not that big of a loss. Try smoothing that out first before you go doing it with really expensive pens. And be aware that whatever you're smoothing, you're voiding your warranty. If that matters to you. So do it at your own risk, but those are the tools you need if you really want to get a smooth writing experience on all your pens. You usually have to do it yourself. All right, Karen Desai on YouTube. I would like to ask, why do pen companies label their nib sizes as fine, medium, or broad, and have varying nib sizes different for each manufacturer? It does kind of seem like a conspiracy, doesn't it? I always like to equate this to women's dress sizes. I would use that analogy before I would use, complain about pen manufacturers. Why are women's dress sizes different from one manufacturer to another? Honestly, it's because you have all these different pen companies that started at different times in different parts of the world. A lot of it is handwork that is done when it comes to tuning and tweaking these things. And that's a lot of it. It's not like fountain pens were created by, one entity and they've been dispersed worldwide through that entity. So there isn't scientific standardization necessarily when it comes to defining a nib size. So really it has been, each one has come up, and there's a lot of history with fountain pens. They're 150 years old or so. So you have years and years and years worth of technological development, product development, things like that, different materials that started to be used, all kinds of different things. Even crazier than the nib sizes, you talk about filling mechanisms and cartridge types and stuff like that. There's all kinds of history that you can get into looking at that. Fountain Pen Network is there. Richard Binder's site's really good, richardspens.com, for reading a lot of like fountain pen history. That will really make you go crazy if you start reading about different filling mechanisms and cartridge types and stuff like that. It's like, why don't they all use one type? You know, it's the same kind of thing with like car parts, you know what I mean? How many different alternators are there out there in the world? Every car has an alternator on it, but why are there 500 million different types? Because every manufacturer uses a different part and all this kind of stuff. So it's no different than it is with a lot of other companies out there that all produce different things. People have different patents on certain things. There's different, you know, stuff like that, that it takes a lot of time and research and development to manufacture these pens. Alloys have changed, technology has changed, there's craftsmanship involved, and, you know, years and decades worth of experience and manufacturing and stuff like that each one of these companies comes up with. Not to mention there are standards that are different based on kind of geographically, like in Japan, for example. The companies that come from Japan, they all make all their own nibs, and they all make them slightly different, and they all make them rather fine, especially on the extra fine and fine nibs. Maybe not so much on the mediums and broads, but they have, you know, because of the Japanese characters that they're writing, they want very fine writing nibs. So their fines and extra fines tend to be a little finer than Europeans, where they're not writing characters, they're writing letters that are fairly uniform in their line widths. So they don't have as much of a need for those really, really fine nibs. So a lot of it's cultural like that. And I think probably the last factor that has to do with maybe why it's so frustrating now, being that you have the internet and you have access to basically any pen that you would possibly want. It has not always been that way. Really only in the last 10 or maybe 15 years, you know, basically has given you access to pretty much any fountain pen in the world that you would want. Before that, it was either through catalogs or brick and mortar stores that you were able to find all these pens. And, you know, catalogs I kind of would lump in with online because you can't test them ahead of time, but a lot of fountain pens were sold in brick and mortar stores. Still are in many parts of the world. But when you're writing with a pen in a store, you're going to write with a pen based on how you experience it. And even if you have a fine nib, the same fine nib doesn't write the same for everybody because there's different writing speed, writing pressure, the ink is different, the paper is different. So there's a lot of different factors. So even if you scientifically have the exact same nib on every single pen, it's going to write a little bit differently person to person. So because for the vast majority of fountain pens history, they've been sold through stores person to person where you're trying them out, there hasn't been as much of a need for standardization because you're experiencing before you buy. Only in the last several years, where online buying has become much more prevalent, and you've had people like me that have been cropping up, has the whole standardization thing been more of an issue. Now, what have I done to help with that? Well, I have the Nibnook tool on gouletpens.com, and basically what that is I have standardized as much as I can by using myself the same ink and same paper for every single pen and every nib combination we have on gouletpens.com. It is actually kind of a pain for me to do that. Every time we carry a new pen, it's like, dang it, I got to find time in my schedule to ink up all these pens and write it very consistently. And we have to, Sarah as our photographer, she does a lot of work to photograph and scan and you know, normalize all these images so they're extremely consistent. It's kind of painstaking to do this Nibnook tool, but what it does is it shows you an actual writing sample of one pen to another, so you can see, oh gosh, the extra fine nib on a, I'm just going to pick on you, sorry, TWSBI, but the extra fine nib on a TWSBI, which uses a German nib, is different than the extra fine nib on a Pilot E95S, which is a Japanese nib. Nothing wrong with either one, it's just they're different. So I provide writing samples of those. That's part of why I do that tool, is so to help to at least give you some idea of what you're getting from one to another without having to buy it and try it and ship it back and forth and be like, oh, this is way finer than I thought. And there's a lot of good reviews out there that people have done, writing samples and so on. And there's other people that just write and kind of generally talk about those. A lot of people kind of overgeneralize too about like, oh, Japanese pens are always finer than European pens. That's not necessarily true. What I will say is that generally I've found extra fine and fine Japanese pens are almost always finer than extra fine and fine European pens. German, you know, whatever, French, UK. That said, it's not necessarily always the case, but that's pretty much usually what's going on. And then the mediums and broads are kind of, they all kind of mesh together and have a lot less variation than the extra fines and fines do. So that's it. That's what I got for you there, Karen. Hopefully that helps you out. All right, John F on Facebook said, how much should you be twisting the cap on twist cap pens, especially TWSBIs? So TWSBI, let me see here. Let me grab one real quick. Forgot to grab one, but as I was saying it, I was saying, you know, it's probably a good idea to have one. So I got a TWSBI 580 all right here. And so TWSBI, for example, has threads. It's actually got an O-ring too. So not a lot of pens have an O-ring. That is just an extra measure that helps to kind of seal up the cap. It's very nice. Thank you, TWSBI, for doing that. But it does make it so that there's not a positive stop. You are twisting it, and it has the O-ring, which has a little bit of play. So I'll twist it, and it'll be right about there where it grabs, and it's very secure. You know, right now, maybe a little bit more, right there. I can also twist it more, right there. So from here to here, that's extra twisting that maybe isn't really necessary, but you can still do it. Some people really try to ratchet it down because it's sort of like, well, gosh, if I ratchet it down this tight and it seals up pretty well, if I ratchet it down even more, it'll seal up even better, and then my nib will never dry out. Not necessarily the case. I wouldn't go to that. Twist it no harder than you need to. As hard as you need to, but no more. So this is actually the reason why a lot of fountain pens have a center band, because when you're twisting the pens together like that, when you have a threaded cap and you're twisting it like that, as you twist it and it gets to the point where it is grabbing, if you're over twisting it and doing it even more, that puts a lot of pressure around the end of the cap. So the reason pen companies will put a center band here is to reinforce the plastic that's on here so that it won't have a tendency to crack and split due to over tightening. That's one measure. And then the other thing that is bad for over tightening, not only does it create pressure because the pen is, you know, creating outward pressure on the cap and can split it, but it's also putting a lot of pressure on these threads on both the cap and the body. And if you're habitually over tightening, you can actually over time strip these threads so that it doesn't even cap at all. So you want to be careful when you're tightening it not to overdo it. And I can't tell you definitively like this many pounds of torque or whatever are needed, because you got to use your own judgment. But basically, hand tighten it until the point where, you know, if you hold it very loosely and grab it just a little bit there and then just a hint more and nothing else, and it'll be just fine and you won't end up damaging anything. Joshua T on Facebook asked, what is the situation with tipping on stub or italic pens? I noticed that the Lamy and the Goulet italic nibs have no tipping. Is there a standard practice, or is it just that some have tipping and some don't? Okay, Joshua, you're calling out the Lamy and the Goulet ones. Those are both stainless steel nibs, okay? And what you're gonna see pretty much from everybody, I can't think of anyone, I'm trying to rack my brain, I can't think of anyone that has a tipped stainless steel italic or stub nib. Maybe I'm wrong, and if I am, I hope you will call me out in the comments. So put that in the comments if you can think of any, but I can't think of any stainless steel nibs that have tipping material on them. And the reason for that is generally they're more economical, so you want to keep costs down. Using a very expensive tipping material plus the process of welding it and honing it and all that stuff drives up the cost quite a bit, and it's not generally worth it to do that on a stainless steel nib, because stainless steel is a pretty hard metal. And yes, you want the tipping material on extra fines and mediums and stuff like that, because it's a very small point of contact. But with an italic nib, you have a much wider nib. A lot more of the nib is making contact on the page, so it's going to wear less on that nib as it would on a fine or a medium or something like that. So you're going to be able to use that nib for years and years and years without it wearing down, because it's a harder metal than gold, and it's going to have a pretty wide area of contact, I guess. So it won't put as much pressure on one individual point of that nib as it would if it were a fine or extra fine or something like that. That said, when you have gold nibs, it's a bit of a different story, because gold is a softer metal and can wear down. Because basically, when you're using paper, it feels really smooth to your hands, but if you look at it kind of microscopically, it's kind of like sandpaper. You know, it's very textured, it's very rough, and that nib gliding across the page like that creates friction. Anytime there's friction, there's heat. Anytime there's heat, there's wear. So you're wearing down that nib, albeit very, very slowly, but over time you're wearing down that nib, with tipping or not. the tipping, the reason you have tipping on it is it's a super hard metal, harder even than stainless steel, that's going to wear less over time than you would. But even a tipped nib, if you use it enough, you're going to wear it down because you're causing friction and you're putting wear on that page, on that pen as you're writing on the page. It's just you're kind of delaying the inevitable by doing that. Now you're talking a very long time when you have a tipped nib. Not as long, but still very long with a stainless steel nib without tipping. A gold nib without tipping is not going to last nearly as long. So that's why you'll pretty much see almost all gold nibs, almost all gold stub nibs tipped. Yeah, even the stubs. Definitely all regular gold nibs, but all gold stub nibs or Italic nibs, you're pretty much going to see those tipped because they just last longer that way. So that's not a steadfast rule, and it does vary from one manufacturer to another, and they may have their reasons for doing that. You can have different alloys, even of gold and stuff like that, that can be different. So it's not all exactly the same. And then you have other nibs, like you have some that are palladium and chromium and titanium and stuff like that. But generally, that's kind of where you're looking at, is the harder metals might have less of a tendency to have a tipping on the stubs, whereas gold nibs are almost always going to have it. All right. Chugging along here. Got a couple of ink questions. This is from Mattia M on Facebook, and I think I have to cough. Give me a second. There we go. Okay, so this is from Mattia M on Facebook. Mattia asked, can we speak about inkwells? Is there any disadvantage or any big no-no in transferring ink from the proprietary bottles to a crystal or glass inkwell? How to handle inks with pigments or particles such as Jeroboam 1670 series. Anyone using inkwells at all, so you really kind of just like throw in the towel at the end there. You can totally use inkwells. Very, very, very acceptable to do. The most important thing when using inkwells, honestly, is just making sure that it seals well. Because fountain pen ink is water-based, and if you don't have it sealed well, the water is going to evaporate out of the ink, and you're going to be left with just the dyes and the other components of the ink behind. It's going to be much less fluid, sludgier, drier writing, not going to perform well. Honestly, if you took a bottle of ink and you unscrewed the cap and just left it sitting out there, you'd actually be amazed in a number of days how visibly that would go down and be left with very thick, sludgy type ink. So the cap sealing well is really, really important. And when you're using a crystal type inkwell, you want to make sure that the cap seals well. That's really kind of the number one most important thing. A next important thing is just making sure that the inkwell is clean, because whenever you're transferring ink from one to another, if you go to an antique store and you buy some really, really old thing that's like dingy and yellowed and stuff like that, you don't want to just like wipe it out with a paper towel and then pour your ink in. You want to actually clean it, maybe use a little bit of bleach in there to like make sure that it's completely, really, really clean. Wash it out after that too to make sure it's crystal clear, pun. And then you can put your ink in there, and that's okay. So just making sure that it's clean is another good thing. Another thing too, so when you're talking about like a crystal inkwell or something like that, generally you're going to want those because they look beautiful and you're going to keep it out. So the only thing I would say is you can totally do that, but with most fountain pen inks are dye based, right? They're dye based, which means that they are, it's a lot of aniline dyes that are used in fountain pen inks. So that means they're not very light fast, generally speaking. So they'll be fine, for everyday writing, and they'll be cool for lasting a really long time if you have them closed up in a notebook. If you're journaling and stuff like that and you keep it closed up, don't be too worried. Where you want to be concerned a little bit is if you're leaving your writing or your ink or whatever out there in direct sunlight for extended periods of time. So if you happen to have a beautiful office with a corner office with a beautiful, south-facing window that gets sunlight all day long, and you have your crystal inkwell that's sitting right there and the sun is just beaming down on that ink all day long, over time, that ink is going to degrade in color and it's going to degrade in quality because of that UV exposure from the sun. Even some UV exposure from some fluorescent lights won't really help it out. It's not as bad as direct sunlight, but still, you're still getting UV exposure from fluorescent lighting even. So you just want to be careful about that. And that's not really so much of a transferring to it, but that's just generally when using crystal inkwells or any other type of inkwell like that. And honestly, that's the case for even just a regular bottle of ink. it's not even transferring, just using a bottle of ink. If you keep it out all day long in direct sunlight, over time, and some inks are more affected than others, but over time it could degrade the color of the ink itself as you're using it. It's not anything I would be too super paranoid about, but it's just if you really want to maintain the integrity of your ink color, just keep it in the box that it comes in, or keep it in a desk drawer or something like that. I know it kind of somewhat defeats the purpose of having your beautiful inkwell displayed, just you have to use your judgment, and there's a trade-off sometimes of doing that. The other thing you asked about using a pigmented or particled ink such as 1670. And by the way, the reason that I think inkwells used to be a lot more popular is because before you had fountain pens using like liquid fountain pen ink, you had, you know, dip pens, which dip pens, you know, like the old school like calligraphy and quills and that kind of thing, those used a lot more pigmented inks and a lot more inks that were light fast. So that wasn't as much of an issue with the light and stuff like that. And honestly, I don't think that most people really cared. Probably I'm making a complete just call based on no reality whatsoever, but my assumption would be that back when fountain pens were just an everyday writing instrument, just before you had ballpoints and all that stuff, fountain pens were just a pen. You didn't care whether your black ink degraded slightly in color and it became a really, really dark gray instead of a black, or you didn't care whether your blue ink was slightly less blue. As long as you could still read it on the page, you didn't care because it was a utility. So you would use a crystal inkwell because it was practical and you had it out and you would just use it, and it wasn't as romantic as it is now because there are far fewer of them. It's much less of a commodity. So I think that may be a factor as well. I don't know. I just completely pulled that out of my head. Just completely pulled that out of thin air. So we'll see. I don't know. Maybe tell me what you think about that if I'm totally just blowing smoke. But there you go. So that's pretty much it. And then if you're transferring an ink like 1670 that has some particulate and stuff like that in there, just make sure you're shaking it really well. That's the thing, is you're going to have some particulate that's going to drop to the bottom of that bottle. And if you just take it, it's sitting there for a while, and you just take it and pour it, you're going to be left with some of that particulate down on the bottom. So shake the living daylights out of it like for a minute or two. And then as soon as you're done shaking it, transfer it to the new inkwell, and you're going to see that all that stuff is gone out of the old bottle, and you're going to be good to go. Cool. Janet on Facebook asked, I've seen you recommending everything from red to black to blue inks, but could you give some turquoise, teal, or blue-green hues? I'm looking for something that's not too dark and maybe shades nicely with finer nibs. Okay, so I'm just going to give you a few here because I realize how long I'm talking on this video today. So there's a lot of really good shades in this range. I mean a lot. So I would definitely recommend going and checking out the swab shop at gouletpens.com because I'm going to throw some inks at you that I personally like, but you may think they look terrible and want others. But you can definitely go to the swab shop, go to shop by color, and then you can see turquoise as one of the pages that we have. So we have a whole color of all turquoises and blue greens and stuff like that that you're asking about. So you can look on that page and just see what appeals to you. So some of my favorites, Diamine Marine is like really kind of up there. That's a lighter one, really good shading. Jeroboam 1670 Emerald of Chivor, that one is darker. It's got a red sheen component to it, some gold glitter. So it may not be for everybody, but it's a very cool ink that I have to throw in there. Lamy Turquoise too, it's a little bit bluer, but really good shading on that one too. Noodler's Navajo Turquoise, that one's going to be kind of similar to Lamy Turquoise, a little bit more of a blue shade. Noodler's Turquoise, which is very different actually than Navajo Turquoise, but Noodler's Turquoise is going to be much more of a blue-green, a little bit of a darker shade, but good shading on that one. And the last one is Private Reserve Blue Suede. That one's going to be similar to Noodler's Turquoise, kind of in that, and Emerald of Chivor, kind of in that darker blue-green kind of shade. And there's a lot of others. I could name you 20 others or 30 others, but go check out the swab shop on gouletpens.com and you can see which are appealing to you. All right, this question I have from Lee is, if you had to pick one song that you would have to listen to, sorry, these are all personal questions, by the way, so I'm going to finish it out with a couple of fun ones. If you had to pick one song that you would have to listen to on repeat for an hour a day, for every day, for the rest of your life, what song would it be, and when would you listen to it? Very specific, hypothetical question here, and I thought about this. I was like, well, there's some songs that I like that are kind of catchy, but you know, you listen to those for like a month and you get totally sick of them. And I think part of the reason is because if a song is too short, if you have to listen to it for an hour a day, you're going to get sick of it that much quicker. So I was thinking, like, what are some of the longest songs that I would not get sick of? And I was like, well, actually, I'm a big fan of classical. I wouldn't say I'm a big fan. I very much appreciate classical music. And if you get classical music, well, you can pick an entire symphony, and that's one song, and that would be great. So one of my favorites would be Beethoven's Ninth Symphony. Just listening to the whole thing, that's the one with Ode to Joy in it, which is the more popular part of it, but the entire thing is like an hour and 6 minutes long or something like that. So I think if I'm gonna have to listen to something an hour a day, every day for the rest of my life, I would pick something that's an hour long. That way I would only listen to the song on repeat once, and it would be every day, rather than picking a 3-minute song and hearing it, whatever, my math is failing me on that one. Oh my gosh, this is embarrassing. 20 times. If I pick a 3-minute song, I'm going to listen to it 20 times a day. I'm going to get sick of it probably on the first day. So picking a symphony, Beethoven's Ninth, I like that. There's a lot of other really good ones. Vivaldi Four Seasons is really good. I would want to go with something not too dark, probably, because I feel like that would be depressing listening to it every day. And since you asked me this hypothetical question that's completely, bogus anyway, you asked me what time would I listen to it. I'm going to completely throw you a curveball here. I would say like 3 in the morning, because I would most likely be asleep. And, if it's not too loud, I'm assuming I would be able to choose the volume. Since you didn't qualify that in the hypothetical here, I would have it be very quiet and listen to it at 3 o'clock in the morning so that it would not wake me up. Maybe I would have some interesting dreams or something listening to an hour-long symphony in my sleep. But I figure if I'm asleep, or chances are I'm asleep, I probably would not get sick of it nearly as much. That's mainly the driving factor here, is if I have to listen to it the rest of my life, I don't want to get sick of it. So there you go. That's what I would have to say. Last question I have for this week. This is from Caitlyn P on Facebook, a really fun one. A fun/personal question. With all of the newer additions to Goulet's offerings, what would be your frankenpen? If you could mix and match bits from all of the pens available, what would you make? I would assume this Visconti Volcano pen material, perhaps an Aurora nib and a Divina Bling, double question mark. So this is a great question, and I'll be completely honest, I didn't really spend that much time picking the different components. So please don't hold me to this like 3 years from now and be like, Brian said that this component was his absolute favorite that he picked his frankenpen. Like, don't hold me to it. I just kind of threw some stuff together. Okay, so don't really take it that seriously. But that said, I do like the volcano on the Homo sapiens. I gotta admit, it's pretty cool. Granted, it's newer, so I tend to like newer things better, and it feels really cool. But there's a lot of other things I love, like ebonite and celluloid and stuff like that too. So I would say I would like to have some volcano in it because it's just a great conversation piece. It feels really cool. I like the feel of it. So I would definitely have to throw that in there somewhere. So I would say like a Homo sapiens would be a pretty good like pen to build off of. So I do like the nibs on Visconti. I do like their larger nib. There's a lot of really good nibs. The nibs on the Delta Dolce Vita is really good. The Pelican M1000 nib is really good. Nibs that are somewhat softer, but I don't really like soft nibs for my everyday writing. I like things that are smooth but not like flexible. So the 23 karat palladium is pretty good. So I would maybe pick that. I also love the Pilot Custom 74 medium nib. I know I've talked about that. It was my first gold nib pen, but I still just really enjoy the way it writes. So it'd be really hard to choose a nib. It's kind of between the two of those. But I would want some component of the thing, and I wrote down some notes. That's why I keep looking at my computer. I would really like to work in somewhere. I love the feel of celluloid too, and the Delta Dolce Vita came out in a blue celluloid a little while ago, and it's got kind of like these like striations in there. I can't even describe it really, but look up Delta Dolce Vita blue celluloid, and it's really, really cool. It's a little more of a sky blue, but the material just looks amazing. So I would maybe have that in the cap somewhere and balance that out with some of the volcano maybe. I like the contoured grip on the Homo sapiens, but I like maybe a little bit deeper contour. Like I like the contour of the Edison Nouveau Premier. I helped design that pen, so I got to pick the contour I really liked. So that I would like, so maybe a little deeper contour than what's on the Homo sapiens. So the contour of the Edison Nouveau Premier. I also love the Divina. Part of it is I love the faceting on it, so maybe I could incorporate that in there with some of the bling. I really appreciate that too. And I think the hook and loop, the hook safe loop lock, or whatever they call it, I'm forgetting in the moment, hook safe lock, is really cool. So I would choose that as the cap mechanism for my pen. They've got the same thing on the Divina. But that would be kind of cool. So maybe a faceted look on the Divina with the contour grip, the hook safe lock. There definitely is a lot of Visconti components in here because they are just really, really kind of cool. And they're newer, so new is always better. All right, Barney Stinson. So work some of that stuff in there. What else did I want to include? I would want an ink window though. That's the thing I don't like about this so much. I wish I had an ink window. So usually you don't have a vacuum filling pen that has an ink window unless it's a demonstrator, but I would want one in there somewhere. Maybe not a whole demonstrator, but I don't know, a demonstrator would be kind of cool too. So maybe work out some demonstrator components or somewhere. I don't know, maybe work that in there somehow. And then let's see here. I would like the slip and seal cap of the Platinum 3776. I realize that may not work necessarily with the hook safe lock of the Visconti, but just that I really like how well the 3776 seals. So maybe just take that in there somewhere. And then I like the vacuum filling. I think it's pretty cool. High ink capacity and just the way you fill is pretty awesome. So maybe this or like the double reservoir vacuum that you get with the Visconti like Opera Master is kind of cool too. I know that one's got a little bit of controversy out there, based on some reviews I've seen from other people, but I also see kind of the way they're filling and using it and maybe isn't quite the proper way. So I'll have to play around with that some more and see, but definitely like the vacuum mechanisms. So something like that. But if I had a vacuum mechanism like that, I would like to be able to disassemble it like the TWSBI VAC 700. So having a tool where you can pull it apart, disassembly of my pen would be something kind of important. So yeah, there you go. So I don't know. And then like clip design, I don't know. I didn't really get too frankenpen with it, but that I figured I went deep enough there. So a lot of different weird random components that I think would be kind of cool. If I had to actually think of something, if I literally, like someday down the road, if I get into actual pen manufacturing, granted, to manufacture a pen with all these different random components would probably cost like $5,000 because of how hard it would be to engineer all this stuff together. But I don't know, it would be kind of fun. So we'll see. All right, so question of the week for this week. I'll go ahead and just piggyback off of what my last question was here. If you could frankenpen all of your favorite pen components into one magical hypothetical pen, what would it be? Price be darned, don't even worry about it, but just if you could take all of your favorite components and put them into one pen, what would all those components be? I would love to hear what that would look like or how it would operate. So comment on YouTube or on the blog, give me some feedback there. So glad to be back. Thanks for tuning in to the whole Q&A here. Really enjoy doing it. Episode 100 will be coming up. We are going to be doing something special for that, so make sure you're looking out for that. It should be kind of neat. And that's kind of what I got for this week. So thank you. If you haven't subscribed on YouTube yet, please do so because you can get this video and lots of other cool ones that we're doing. If you haven't subscribed to Periscope yet, go ahead and download that app on your phone and check it out because I'm doing a lot more broadcasts on there these days. I'm even toying around with the idea of taking some of the Periscopes, recording them, and then putting them on YouTube. It's not quite as straightforward a process as you might think because a lot of the downloading app things or the way that you download those videos doesn't include the chat, which kind of stinks. That's like half the experience. So I'm looking at ways to be able to capture it with the chat. So I don't know, give me some feedback on that. If you think that would be kind of cool to see on YouTube, then you would be able to kind of see them indefinitely. I'm thinking more like product reviews and stuff like that I could do live, get questions real time, and then put them up on YouTube. I don't know. Very much an idea I'm throwing out there. So give me some feedback on that. So I hope you have a great week, and be sure to tune in next week. We'll be doing another one of these. And yeah, check out gouletpens.com for any of the products that I've talked about here today. Thanks so much for watching, and right on.